8 simple habits that support a healthier brain. Nearly half of all dementia cases may be connected to something surprisingly ordinary, not genetics, not age, something most people overlook every single day. For decades, we were told that memory decline was simply the price of growing older, an inevitable cost of living a long life. Newer research tells a different story, and it is a far more hopeful one. This video is for general educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you have concerns about your brain health or memory, it may be helpful to speak with a qualified healthcare professional who knows your personal history. Sit with that number for a moment. Researchers have found that a meaningful portion of dementia cases around the world may be connected to factors that are, at least in part, within a person's influence. Prevention is never guaranteed because nothing in medicine ever is. But it does mean that small, daily choices, the quiet, unremarkable ones, may carry more weight than most people realize. Over the next several minutes, we will walk through 8 everyday habits that research suggests may support brain health over time. Some of them will sound familiar, a few might surprise you. And there is one habit near the end of this list, one that neurologists increasingly describe as one of the most overlooked pieces of long-term brain health. So stay with us, because that one alone could change how you think about your entire daily routine. Number 1, prioritize quality sleep. Sleep has a reputation problem. For a long time, it was treated as downtime, a pause button between the moments that actually mattered. But brain researchers now describe sleep as an active process, one where the brain performs a kind of nightly housekeeping. During deep sleep, cerebrospinal fluid appears to help clear away metabolic waste products, including proteins that have been linked to certain forms of cognitive decline. Skimping on sleep night after night may interfere with this natural clearing process. Consider Margaret, a retired schoolteacher in her early 70s. For years, she prided herself on needing only 5 hours of sleep a night, wearing it almost like a badge of honor. She noticed she was misplacing her keys more often, forgetting names at church, and feeling foggy by mid-afternoon. When she mentioned it to her doctor, one of the first questions wasn't about her diet or her puzzles. It was about her sleep. Once she began prioritizing 7 to 8 hours a night and turning off screens an hour before bed, she noticed her afternoon fog started to lift within a few weeks. Her story isn't proof of anything definitive, but it echoes what many sleep researchers describe in clinical settings. Quality matters just as much as quantity. Frequent nighttime waking, untreated sleep apnea, or irregular sleep schedules may all interfere with the deep, restorative stages of sleep where this cellular cleanup seems to happen most. If you snore heavily, wake up gasping, or feel exhausted no matter how many hours you spend in bed, it may be worth discussing this with a healthcare provider, since treatable sleep disorders are more common than many people assume. Small, consistent adjustments tend to help more than dramatic overnight changes. Going to bed and waking up at roughly the same time each day, even on weekends, may help regulate the body's internal clock. Dimming lights in the evening, limiting caffeine after early afternoon, and creating a cool, dark, quiet bedroom environment are all strategies that sleep specialists commonly recommend. None of this guarantees perfect cognitive health, but it removes one of the more significant obstacles standing in its way. Now, sleep sets the stage, but what happens once you're awake matters just as much, starting with how your body moves through the day. Number 2 is move your body regularly. It might seem strange that something as physical as exercise would rank so highly on a list about brain health, but the connection is stronger than most people expect. Physical activity appears to increase blood flow to the brain, which may support the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to brain cells. Some studies suggest that regular aerobic activity may be associated with increased volume in the hippocampus, a region of the brain closely tied to memory formation. Take the example of Robert, a 68-year-old retired mechanic who had spent most of his working life on his feet, then transitioned into a much more sedentary lifestyle after retirement. Within a couple of years, he noticed he felt mentally sluggish, describing it to his daughter as feeling like his thoughts were moving through molasses. At her encouragement, he started walking briskly for 30 minutes most mornings, nothing elaborate, just consistent movement. Several months later, he mentioned to his physician that he felt sharper, more present in conversations, and less prone to the mental fog that had crept in after retirement. The type of movement doesn't have to be intense to potentially offer benefit. Brisk walking, swimming, cycling, dancing, and even gardening have all been associated in various studies with improved cognitive function in older adults. What seems to matter most is consistency over time, rather than occasional bursts of high-intensity effort. Health organizations commonly suggest aiming for at least 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week, though it may be worth discussing an appropriate exercise plan with a healthcare provider, particularly for those managing existing health conditions. There's also an emotional layer to this habit. Movement has been linked to reduced symptoms of anxiety and depression, both of which can independently affect memory and concentration. So when you move your body, you may be supporting your brain from more than one direction at once. Speaking of supporting the brain from multiple directions, let's talk about something that happens 3 or more times a day for most of us, often without a second thought. Number 3, feed your brain with the right nutrients. The brain is a remarkably energy-hungry organ. Despite making up only a small percentage of total body weight, it uses a substantial portion of the body's daily energy supply. What you eat may influence not just your waistline, but potentially the structure and function of your brain over time. Diets rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, fish, and healthy fats, similar to what is often described as a Mediterranean-style eating pattern, have been associated in research with better cognitive outcomes in aging populations. Omega-3 fatty acids, found in fatty fish like salmon and sardines, have drawn particular interest from researchers studying brain structure, though more research continues in this area. On the other hand, diets heavy in processed foods, added sugars, and refined carbohydrates have been associated with poorer cognitive performance in some studies, possibly related to their effects on blood vessels and inflammation throughout the body. Consider Alina, a woman in her 60s who had spent much of her adult life relying on convenient, processed meals due to a demanding work schedule. After a routine checkup revealed elevated blood sugar levels, her doctor suggested gradually shifting toward more whole foods, not as a strict diet, but as a sustainable lifestyle change. She began adding more leafy greens, swapping white bread for whole grain options, and incorporating fish into her weekly meals twice a week. She didn't do this specifically for her brain, she did it for her blood sugar, but she later mentioned to her doctor that her thinking felt clearer and her energy more stable throughout the day. It's worth noting that no single food acts as a magic solution, and no eating pattern can guarantee protection against cognitive decline. However, the overall pattern of what we eat day after day across years and decades appears to matter more than any individual meal. Small, gradual changes, like adding one extra vegetable to dinner or choosing water over sugary drinks, tend to be more sustainable than sweeping overhauls. Hydration deserves a brief mention here too, since it's easy to overlook. The brain is made up largely of water, and even mild dehydration has been associated in some studies with temporary reductions in concentration and short-term memory performance. Older adults are particularly prone to underdrinking fluids, partly because the sense of thirst tends to become less reliable with age. Keeping a water bottle within easy reach throughout the day, and paying attention to hydration especially during warmer months, may offer a simple, often overlooked layer of support alongside a balanced diet. And speaking of things we do daily without thinking twice, let's turn to something that many people assume they've outgrown once they finish their formal education. Number 4, keep learning new things. There's a phrase researchers sometimes use called cognitive reserve. Think of it like a kind of mental savings account, one that some scientists believe may help the brain adapt and compensate even when changes occur with age. One of the primary ways people appear to build this reserve is through ongoing mental engagement, particularly novel and challenging activities, rather than passive or repetitive ones. This is different from simply staying busy. Doing the same crossword puzzle format every day, for instance, may offer less benefit over time than learning something entirely unfamiliar, because the brain tends to respond most to genuine novelty and challenge. Learning a new language, picking up a musical instrument, or even learning to paint later in life all require the brain to form new neural connections in ways that familiar, well-worn tasks may not. Take the story of Harold, a retired accountant who decided, somewhat on a whim, to learn to play the piano at the age of 71. He had never played an instrument in his life and admitted to his grandchildren that he felt embarrassed at first, fumbling through beginner exercises meant for children. But he stuck with it. 2 years later, he could play several full pieces, and he described the process itself, the frustration, the small victories, the steady improvement, as one of the most mentally stimulating experiences of his later years. Whether or not it directly changed his brain's structure isn't something that can be proven from one person's experience, but his story reflects a broader pattern researchers have observed: that novel, effortful learning tends to engage the brain in ways that passive activities simply do not. The good news is that this doesn't require enrolling in university courses or mastering a difficult new skill overnight. Reading about unfamiliar topics, trying new recipes that require multiple steps, learning to use new technology, or even taking a different route on a regular walk can all introduce a degree of novelty that keeps the brain actively engaged. The key ingredient seems to be challenge paired with curiosity, rather than repetition of what already feels comfortable and automatic. But learning new things rarely happens in isolation, and that brings us to a factor that researchers increasingly view as just as important as diet or exercise, even though it's often overlooked entirely. Number 5, nurture social connections. Loneliness doesn't just affect mood, it appears to leave a measurable mark on the brain as well. Several long-term studies have found associations between social isolation and increased risk of cognitive decline in older adults, independent of other health factors. Researchers theorize that social interaction naturally exercises multiple cognitive functions at once, including memory, language processing, and emotional regulation, all in ways that are difficult to replicate through solitary activities. Consider the experience of Dorothy, a widow in her late 70s who, after losing her husband of nearly 50 years, withdrew significantly from her usual social circle. Her daughter noticed that within a year, Dorothy seemed to be repeating stories more frequently and struggling with word finding during conversations, something that hadn't been an issue before. Concerned, her daughter encouraged her to join a local community group that met weekly for coffee and conversation. Dorothy resisted at first, feeling it was easier to stay home. But after a few months of regular attendance, her daughter noticed she seemed more like herself again, more verbally quick, more emotionally present. Grief and isolation are complicated, layered experiences, and no single change explains everything. But Dorothy's story mirrors a pattern many geriatric specialists describe seeing in their patients. Meaningful social connection doesn't require large social circles or constant activity. Research suggests that the quality of relationships may matter more than the sheer quantity of them. Regular phone calls with a close friend, weekly meals with family, participation in a religious or community group, or even consistent conversations with a neighbor can all provide this kind of protective social engagement. For those who have lost a spouse, moved away from family, or find themselves isolated for other reasons, it may be worth exploring local senior centers, volunteer opportunities, or community classes as a way to rebuild these connections gradually. There's an emotional thread that runs underneath all of this too, one that leads us directly into our next habit, because how we manage our emotional world on a daily basis may matter just as much as who we spend it with. Number 6, manage chronic stress. Occasional stress is a normal, even useful part of life. It sharpens focus and helps the body respond to real challenges. But chronic, unrelenting stress is a different story altogether. When stress hormones like cortisol remain elevated over long periods, researchers have observed potential effects on the hippocampus, the brain region heavily involved in forming new memories. Some studies suggest that prolonged, unmanaged stress may be associated with shrinkage in this particular brain region over time, though research in this area continues to evolve. Think about James, a business owner in his early 60s who spent decades under near constant pressure, managing employees, finances, and long hours with very little downtime. He often joked that stress was simply part of the job, something to push through rather than address. After a health scare unrelated to his brain, his doctor gently pointed out that his chronic stress levels might be contributing to more than just his blood pressure. James began incorporating short daily walks, deep breathing exercises, and eventually therapy sessions to work through some of the pressure he had been carrying for years. He later described feeling like a fog had lifted, not overnight, but gradually over several months. Stress management doesn't require eliminating stress entirely, which usually isn't realistic anyway. Instead, it often involves developing tools to respond to stress differently. Deep breathing exercises, meditation, spending time in nature, journaling, and talking through difficulties with a trusted friend or therapist have all been associated with reduced stress-related symptoms. For some people, professional support through therapy or counseling can offer structured tools for managing chronic stress that self-directed efforts alone may not fully address. It's also worth mentioning that untreated anxiety and depression can sometimes mimic or worsen cognitive symptoms, including memory difficulties and trouble concentrating. If persistent low mood or anxiety is affecting daily functioning, speaking with a mental health professional may be a meaningful and appropriate step, both for emotional well-being and for overall brain health. Sleep, movement, and stress also tend to feed into one another in ways that are easy to miss. Poor sleep can make stress feel more intense the following day, and elevated stress can, in turn, make restful sleep harder to achieve that same night. Recognizing this cycle is often the first step toward interrupting it, whether that means setting a consistent wind-down routine in the evening or simply giving yourself permission to step away from a stressful task for a few minutes of fresh air and quiet. Now let's shift to two senses that many people take for granted every single day, until the moment they don't work quite the way they used to. Number 7, protect your hearing and vision. This might be the habit that surprises people most, because it doesn't sound like it belongs on a list about brain health at all. But research has increasingly pointed to a connection between untreated hearing loss and increased risk of cognitive decline. One theory suggests that when the brain has to work harder to process unclear or missing sound, it may divert cognitive resources away from other functions, including memory. Another theory points to the social withdrawal that often accompanies hearing loss, since conversations become exhausting or frustrating, leading some people to avoid social situations altogether, which circles back to the isolation concerns we discussed earlier. Consider the story of Walter, a man in his 70s who had noticed his hearing declining for years but resisted getting a hearing aid, viewing it as an unwelcome symbol of aging. He started avoiding restaurants and family gatherings, finding it easier to stay quiet than to ask people to repeat themselves constantly. His family noticed he seemed more withdrawn and at times more confused in conversations. When he finally agreed to be fitted for hearing aids, his daughter described the change as almost immediate, not just in his hearing, but in his willingness to engage, laugh, and participate again. Vision plays a similar, if less discussed, role. Clear vision supports safe movement, independent reading, and continued engagement in hobbies, all of which contribute to an active, stimulated brain. Regular eye examinations can catch treatable conditions like cataracts or changes in prescription that, left unaddressed, might otherwise limit a person's ability to stay engaged with the activities that keep their mind active. The takeaway here is refreshingly practical. Routine hearing and vision checks and prompt treatment when issues are found may offer more benefit to long-term brain health than many people realize. These are some of the most manageable habits on this entire list, and yet they are often the most overlooked, sometimes for years at a time. And that brings us to our 8th and final habit, one that ties together everything we've discussed so far, because none of these habits can be properly monitored or adjusted without it. Number 8, schedule regular health checkups. High blood pressure, high cholesterol, and elevated blood sugar levels are often described as silent conditions because they typically produce no obvious symptoms in their early stages. Yet each of these has been linked in research to increased risk of vascular changes that may affect brain health over time. The brain relies on a dense network of blood vessels, and conditions that damage blood vessels elsewhere in the body may also affect blood flow within the brain. Consider Frank, a man in his mid-60s who felt physically fine, no headaches, no fatigue, nothing that would prompt concern. He attended a routine checkup mostly at his wife's insistence, and it was there that his doctor discovered his blood pressure had been elevated for what was likely years. Left unaddressed, uncontrolled blood pressure has been associated in research with increased risk of certain types of cognitive decline, related to its effects on blood vessels throughout the body, including those in the brain. Frank began taking prescribed medication and adjusting his diet, and his numbers gradually improved over the following months. Regular checkups also provide an opportunity to monitor other health factors that may indirectly affect brain health, including thyroid function, vitamin levels, and medication interactions, since certain medications can sometimes contribute to memory or concentration difficulties as a side effect. This is exactly why it's so valuable to discuss any new cognitive symptoms with a healthcare provider rather than assuming they're simply a normal, unavoidable part of aging. Sometimes what looks like cognitive decline is actually a treatable and reversible condition entirely. This habit might be the least glamorous item on our list. There's no new skill to learn, no dramatic lifestyle transformation involved. But it may also be one of the most quietly powerful, because it creates the foundation that allows every other habit we've discussed to actually work as intended. So where does this leave us? Across all 8 of these habits, sleep, movement, nutrition, mental stimulation, social connection, stress management, sensory health, and routine medical care, a consistent theme keeps emerging. Brain health rarely comes down to one single dramatic decision. It tends to be built gradually, through small, repeated choices made across months and years. Researchers have suggested that a significant portion of dementia risk factors worldwide may be connected to modifiable lifestyle elements, a statistic that offers something genuinely rare in medicine, a meaningful degree of influence over an outcome that so many people assume is entirely left to chance. None of this is about achieving perfection, and none of it guarantees a particular outcome, because human health is far too complex for any single formula to promise that. But it does suggest that the small, unremarkable choices made every single day, going to bed a little earlier, taking a walk, calling a friend, scheduling that overdue checkup, may carry more weight over the course of a lifetime than most of us ever stop to consider. If you found this information valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Which of these 8 habits do you already practice, and which one do you think you might try adding to your routine? Let us know in the comments below. We read through them and genuinely enjoy hearing your stories and perspectives. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, consider sharing it with someone in your life who might benefit from it too. And if you'd like to see more educational content like this, subscribing helps us know it's worth continuing to make. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.